the 2022 NCJW Dallas Birthday Lunch and Share to introduce our speaker today. Liz?
Thank you, Chip. And thank you so much to all of you who are logged in today and supporting NCJW of Greater Dallas. New York Times best-selling author, Emmy award-winning news producer, war zone photojournalist, contributing writer at The Atlantic, essays published in The New Yorker, The New York Times, O Magazine, Slate, The Nation, and more. TV writer on the Netflix hit Emily in Paris. Her column, When Cupid is a Prying Journalist, was adapted for the Modern Love streaming series. These are the bullet points of Deborah Copaken's professional career, but it is the trials and tribulations of her personal life that make her ideally suited to be our event speaker today. A Harvard-educated Jewish woman, Deborah's upbringing and background will feel familiar to many of us. And yet, as detailed in her recent memoir, Lady Parts, Deborah has weathered crises that mirror the challenges experienced by the women and families we serve through our community service work. Challenges that overwhelmingly exist because of policy failures and systemic inequalities that NCJW advocates to change. Her tale of bodily destruction and resurrection during her marital rupture will no doubt inspire you to continue our sacred work on behalf of all the world's Deborahs. Please join me in welcoming Deborah Copaken.
Hello, everyone. So I obviously had a different beginning of this keynote all planned out back before Omicron thwarted our plans for an in-person gathering, and back before a man hadn't taken hostages in a shul in your neighborhood. Then, like all of you last weekend, I was following the Dallas synagogue standoff with a sense of panic and horror that felt all too familiar. This again, but of course, this again. Why would it ever be otherwise? We know better than most that the minute you become complacent as a Jew is the moment that those who hate you will remind you just how much. Moreover, until people actually try to kill us for being Jews, no one really cares or sees the problem. David Baddiel's recent book, which I highly recommend, by the way, is called Jews Don't Count, and it maps out all the ways in which modern day racism against Jews is not even really seen as real racism, much less an issue worthy of discussion. Jews, he writes, are the only objects of racism who are imagined by the racists as both low and high status. Jews are stereotyped by the racists in all the same ways that other minorities are, as lying, thieving, dirty, vile, stinking, but also as moneyed, privileged, powerful, and secretly in control of the world. Jews are somehow both subhuman and humanity's secret masters, end quote. All this to say, I'm really sorry for what your community experienced last weekend. Anti-Semitism is clearly alive and well, and fear of dying during a Shabbat service should never be our status quo. Today, however, as my that lovely introduction explained, I am not here to talk about anti-Semitism. I'm here to talk to you about another ism, sexism, and everything that falls under its umbrella. Ageism, sexual harassment, misogyny, poor health outcomes, financial inequality. Yes, even for somebody like me, Harvard educated, Emmy award winning, all of that. On the surface, these don't seem like deadly threats when you say them out loud. They seem like social issues, right? Everyday annoyances, stuff we can overcome with the right attitude, gumption, and strength. But make no mistake, sexism, like anti-Semitism, is as real and as virulent as it ever was. In fact, it nearly killed me several times over. Let me explain. In 2013, driven by frustrations over my experiences with sexism and misogyny in the fields of arts and letters, I pounded out a rage-fueled essay and sold it to the nation. I called it My So-Called Post-Feminist Life in Arts and Letters. My essay was posted online just before I boarded a plane with my then 17-year-old son to Ohio to go on a college tour of Oberlin. I figured the limited number of readers of the nation would read about the times I was called a slut, battlefield Barbie, bang bang girl, and soccer mom in training in professional book reviews of my work. And they might be surprised or maybe upset by the number of citations in which I was blamed for my own sexual assaults, physical assaults, and at gunpoint muggings. But then they'd nod their head in lefty solidarity, shrug their shoulders, and move on. Instead, by the time we landed in Cleveland, my essay had gone so viral, my phone was blowing up with thousands of notifications and dozens of requests for interviews. There were also dozens of trolls who not only spewed vitriol and ad hominem attacks, one of them, an infamous hacker and Wikipedia vandalizer, actually deleted the entirety of my professional history online, including my Emmy, before being permanently banned from Wikipedia. Apparently, I wasn't the first woman of letters whose life and biography he had expunged into non-existence. In other words, in response to my essay about the problem of female erasure, I was erased. I was also unable to sell another book for 6 years. Despite being an award-winning New York Times bestselling author, for one, I had upset the clubby publishing industry. For another, no one, I was told, was interested in reading memoirs by middle-aged women. Never mind that, statistically speaking, 85% of book buyers who purchase 10 or more books a year are middle-aged women. The publishing industry has traditionally relied on gut instinct, not data. And their gut had pegged me as publishing kryptonite instead of seeing the entire discriminatory industry as flawed and in need of new and different voices. Women of color, immigrants, LGBTQ authors, writers fighting their way out of homelessness, poverty, and domestic violence. And yes, outspoken middle-aged women like me. It is no coincidence that a year and a half after Black Lives Matters, the bestseller lists were finally filled with multiple Black voices. That female editors, many of them Black, have finally risen to some of the top jobs in publishing. As for me, without #MeToo, without the bravery of other women using their outdoor voices against the patriarchy, and without my ally, my Random House editor, Mark Warren, yes, a man, I would not be sitting here on Zoom talking to you about my new memoir, Lady Parts. In fact, I would have not been given any sort of platform whatsoever. Speaking out back in 2013 had not only erased my Wikipedia entry, it had also erased my voice, my ability to earn a living with my writing, and even at darker moments, my will to live. In September of that same year, after publishing that article and blowing up my career, I also blew up my 2-decade marriage. Speaking the truth in both domains, professional and domestic, suddenly mattered too much for me to keep playing nice and staying silent about pain points, abuses, and inequalities in each. The lie of omission in love or work is still a lie you must live with every day until it either erupts into a geyser of magma or destroys you. So, how exactly does a wife leave her husband in America? Not easily. We are the only developed country on earth without a national universal healthcare system, paid maternity leave, an affordable path to divorce, or subsidized childcare. Yet another way women, particularly those seeking to leave abusive or untenable relationships, face discrimination that feels impossible to overcome. In fact, looking back, I muddled through an entire decade and a half of marital conflict, emotional abuse, and dissatisfaction until I could take it no more. Did I hold on to my untenable marriage longer than I should have because staying in it meant having health insurance? Yes. Yes, I did. And this is crazy, shameful in a wealthy, industrialized nation, and as it turned out, highly detrimental to my health. With a husband belatedly diagnosed on the autism spectrum, I lived under a constant state of emotional stress, and I mean constant. Dr. Lorenzo Cohen, the director of the Integrative Medicine program at MD Anderson, studied the effect of stress on the structure and mutations of our body cells. He concluded the following, quote, "Stress has a profound impact on how your body's systems function. Stress makes your body more hospitable to cancer," end quote. On the day my marriage ended, which was the same day I drove my son to college, I found a breast lump. There is no breast cancer, I should note, in my family's history. I do not have the BRCA gene. All four of my grandparents died from heart disease. My father died of pancreatic cancer, but he also had type 2 diabetes, which is a disease of the pancreas, and he was often non-compliant. With this most likely stress-induced breast lump, which I could not afford to treat, I thus began a 5-year plunge off the middle class ladder and medical odyssey from which I am still emerging. My husband had moved across the country, and my landlord raised my rent from $3,500 a month to nearly $5,000 a month. So after taking in boarders, I moved into a cheaper, albeit black mold and cockroach infested apartment with a broken boiler, none of which the slumlord in my low-income neighborhood would fix. My youngest child and I were sick with upper respiratory illnesses and oozing eyes for the next 4 years, all the time. Without health insurance to treat my breast lump, I had to find a corporate job with benefits. When that proved difficult to find, despite my best efforts, ageism in hiring older women is one of the only remaining isms that we as a society refuse to acknowledge or fight to rectify. I had to find a medical establishment that would be willing to give me a mammogram for free. I want to pause here and say if I lived just over the border in Canada or across the Atlantic in France or in the UK, none of this would be an issue. I would have gone to the nearest clinic and asked for my free mammogram. In fact, the government would have sent me a reminder to go get my free breast screening. Then if a lump were found, I would have been treated for that lump, also for free. Instead, after nabbing a free mammogram at the Breast Center of Harlem, I was diagnosed with DCIS, aka stage 0 breast cancer, which, granted, is the best kind of breast cancer to have if you have to have it, as it hasn't yet spread beyond the lump itself. So it's easy to treat with a lumpectomy. But I then had to wait 3 whole months with a cancerous lump inside me until the health insurance that came with the position at the quote unquote health magazine where I finally found work as an executive editor kicked in a month after my start date, which is now standard practice for corporations looking to trim costs. For an entire month after you start a job, you live without health insurance and hope you don't get sick. I'm putting health magazine in quotes because my place of work was not really a health magazine so much as it was a highly deceptive bait and switch pharmaceutical advertising machine hiding under the rubric of a health magazine. They fired me a few months after my start date for, get this, excessive absences. "We couldn't even find you to fire you," said the head of HR, pointing his finger in my face, even though my boss knew exactly where I was, taking dictation from one of our bloggers with MS who had lost the use of his hands. All of the other absences, 9 in all, over the course of those 3 months, were spent at Sloan Kettering, the cancer hospital in New York City, where I was being treated. It was dangerous, I suddenly realized, to be unhealthy at a health magazine. In America, again, unlike most developed countries, when you get fired, you don't get severance to tide you over until you find your next job. Plus, you get slapped with monthly COBRA fees that cost more than most rents, which is insane considering how easy it is in the US to fire workers. In fact, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development places the United States dead last on a list of 71 nations ranked according to how difficult it is to fire workers. Here, with a growing corporate insistence on forcing workers to sign at-will contracts, firing people is literally as easy as saying, "Goodbye, don't come back tomorrow." Without severance, I could ill afford my rent, let alone the $2,300 extra a month in COBRA fees to keep my health insurance, which didn't matter anyway because by some bizarre administrative snafu, suddenly my COBRA health benefits had been cut off anyway, making it impossible for me to afford the $6,000 MRI I needed to make sure my breast lump was definitively gone. Are you seeing a trend here? All the ways in which tying healthcare to our jobs makes us all both sicker and more vulnerable to illness, which statistically affects women more than men and Black women worst of all. Quote, 140,000 American jobs were lost. All of them were women, read a headline at the beginning of 2021. When healthcare is tied to one's place of employment, it's the women who suffer in far greater numbers, with BIPOC women getting hit the hardest. Make no mistake, healthcare is both a feminist and a racial justice issue. Desperate to get that MRI, I took the only available journalism job with benefits I could find as an editor and staff writer for a new online magazine, which was started by a businessman who'd sold his company to Amazon for $545 million. He offered to pay me $39,000 a year in New York City. I told him I would not be able to pay 2 college tuitions, rent, food, and childcare on that income as a solo parent of 3, but he knew he had me over a barrel. I needed that MRI stat. Only later would I learn that the man who worked right next to me, my good friend doing the same job, he was earning $200,000 a year to my 39. 6 months later, the editor-in-chief of The Observer, Ken Kurson, emailed me to ask me out to lunch and offer me a job. I accepted it, only to be told after resigning from my other journalism job that there wasn't really a job or the health insurance that comes with a job. I could freelance for him, but that was all. Kurson's emails to me grew more and more inappropriate. Quote, "In another life, I'd be Mr. Copaken," one read, followed by, quote, "I love your sloppy seconds," end quote, and quote, "Are you proposing marriage to me?" End quote. All unprompted. Or he'd confide in me that his marriage was breaking up and ask, would he be a hot commodity on the dating market? Would anyone, he wondered, want his, quote, pilgrim soul? Eventually, he was finally idiotic enough to write the quiet part out loud in an email from his company email address. Quote, "How come you never asked me out?" End quote, he wrote. Reading those words, I fainted, followed by a panic attack that was so intense, my colleagues at the PR firm where I'd finally found a job, albeit the soul-crushing kind, anything for health insurance, threw me in a taxi to the hospital. I tried to contact HR at The Observer to report a case of sexual harassment, but there was no process by which a freelancer could report sexual harassment, only staffers. I reported it to my editor. It doesn't seem like any of my business," she wrote back. Eventually, I wrote up the story for The Atlantic in the form of a tongue-in-cheek listicle called "How to Lose Your Job from Sexual Harassment in 33 Easy Steps." Once again, that story went wacko viral. Into my various inboxes poured letter after letter telling similar tales of sexual harassment horror, but this time, a dozen of those letters described horrors at the hands of the same editor. 2 of them were for men. Quote, "Ken was a creep to me, condescending as well," end quote. Quote, "Your frightening experience with him gave me flashbacks. The way he spoke to me haunts me to this day. Drag the ogre into the daylight," end quote. Quote, "I woke up to your article about Ken Kurson. I had an insane, if not criminal, experience with him that I'd love to talk to you about," end quote. To keep all these stories straight, I created a spreadsheet. Eventually, my harasser was offered a job in the Trump White House. Because of course he was. When the FBI later showed up at my door to do a background check, I handed them my spreadsheet of victims. One victim in particular had a claim that was criminal, a bizarre case of cruel and frightening cyberstalking. Kurson was eventually arrested for this crime. Then, on Trump's last day in office, literally at 4 a.m. on the morning of Biden's inauguration, Kurson was pardoned by the president, putting me, the whistleblower, at grave risk of revenge and reprisal by a man who once wrote me an email in which he said, quote, "I come from a grudge-holding desert people," end quote. What am I supposed to do now? I asked the FBI. Who protects me now? As a last resort, they said I could always go into witness protection. Yeah, no, I said. Kurson was recently arrested again on similar, if different, criminal charges. He's now awaiting trial. I lost sleep, sanity, and several years of both my professional footing and income to this sexual harasser. But unfortunately, sexual harassment is not a crime punishable by law, which, if you think about it, is nuts. A common thief can steal my purse with $5 in it and be put in jail for years, but steal a single mother's entire income, future, emotional equilibrium, health insurance, and health. You might get a corporate slap on the wrist, sensitivity training, or a pink slip, but you don't go to jail. Simultaneous to all this nonsense, I find out I have precancer of the cervix. I'd already had a hysterectomy back in 2012, during which I'd been advised to keep my cervix in. This confused me back then. Why? Why not just yank it out with the uterus? Did the cervix have a special purpose other than dilating during pregnancy and leading sperm to egg? It is believed, said my OBGYN using the passive voice, that the cervix might play a role in sexual pleasure. Well, for goodness sake, I said, keep it in, ignoring the uncertainty of that might, the lack of any study proving anything, the passive voice conjecture. It is believed? Who believes this? Why? Now, 5 years later, that cervix was diseased, and my surgeon was asking me why on earth I'd kept it when I'd had the hysterectomy. When I told her what my doctor had said about its possible involvement with sexual pleasure, my surgeon shook her head, looked down, and sighed. That theory, she said, it's been debunked. The truth is, no one had actually studied the cervix role in sexual pleasure. A bunch of dudes in white coats had simply decided, based on nothing, that it might play a role, when anyone with actual lady parts could have told them that it didn't. In other words, if you're sitting here on this Zoom and you have a uterus, do not rely on your doctors to tell you what's what. Find an expert in your malady, not a generalist. Read the most recent scientific studies, if there even are any. Question everything, every decision, every piece of advice, every prescription or lack thereof, because sexism in medicine is as virulent and destructive as sexism in any other domain, if not more so. Case in point, it took nearly 16 years for the adenomyosis that led to my hysterectomy to be diagnosed, and only then because my hemoglobin was measured during annual physical as a 7. A 7. Normal hemoglobin reading for a woman is 12 and above. Case in point, a researcher who was studying Viagra in women noticed that his subjects were reporting a complete elimination of their period cramps while taking Viagra for up to 4 hours with no side effects whatsoever. Why do you not know this? Because when this researcher asked the NIH for funding to complete his studies, his funding was denied. He asked again, denied again. Dysmenorrhea, said the all-male panel, is not a real medical issue worthy of research dollars. Case in point, if you get a hip replacement or a knee replacement, you are getting a hip or a knee built for a man. Case in point, dosages for medicine are based on a male body, not a female. Case in point, women are routinely gaslit in their doctor's offices, made to feel stupid. Case in point, if you present as female and you're asked to describe your pain on a scale of 1 to 10, the doctor, and this has been studied, the doctor will mentally shave off a few points. If you present as male, they'll assume that you are underreporting your pain. Case in point, because of the opioid epidemic, hospitals are no longer giving opioids to women who've had cesareans. But if you're a man having a vasectomy, no problem, have a Percocet. Case in point, for many women, getting an IUD inserted is extremely painful, like blackout painful, but there is no medical protocol in place to provide pain management prior to its insertion. Women on this Zoom and those of you who bleed monthly, please, I beg you, ask for pain relief when you need it. Over-report your pain to balance out the scientifically proven bias against anyone believing you. I once was told I was experiencing a bad case of gas 2 hours before an emergency appendectomy. My doctor literally stood over me in the waiting room of his office where I'd passed out from pain, saying, "Come on, it can't be that bad." It was that bad. Learn to use a Diva cup so you can measure your monthly blood loss. If it's excessive, you might be suffering from adenomyosis or endometriosis or worse. Do you sense anger in my voice? I do too. But just wait till you hear the rest of my story. 3 weeks after my cervix removal, the stitches holding me together came undone, and I became what I jokingly refer to as a blood clot howitzer. Viscera was literally shooting out of me at such a frightening rate that had my daughter not found me wandering the apartment in a delirious daze at 1:30 a.m., I would definitely not be sitting here talking to you. In fact, by the time we took Uber Pool to the emergency room because I feared the hidden cost of an ambulance, which is also crazy in a developed country, I was nearly dead. Blood poured out of my body like a waterfall as I passed out in the emergency room and was rushed in for emergency surgery to save my life, while my 20-year-old daughter tried to find allies in my phone to join her at the hospital. Had anyone warned me of the possibility of vaginal cuff dehiscence following the removal of my cervix? Nope. No, they had not. In fact, the first time I ever heard the clinical word for my near death was a day after surviving it. Worse, I'd already gone to the emergency room 1 week prior, complaining of intense internal pain, bleeding, and a definitive tugging, I called it, which were the stitches at the top of my vaginal canal slowly coming undone. But after waiting on a gurney in the hallway for several hours, I was sent home from the emergency room with a prescription, forget this, an antibiotic. Did anyone look inside me with a speculum? No, they did not. We don't have an OBGYN on call, said the emergency room physician. These things are best discussed between you and your doctor during normal business hours. But what if you have a gynecological emergency in the emergency room, I said, knowing I was having one, but once again being gaslit into believing I was fine. It was as if he and the hospital had never considered that a woman might be literally coming undone in need of immediate care. After my emergency surgery a week later, when I tried to research the incidence of vaginal cuff dehiscence in the general population, I came up empty-handed. The best the medical literature could offer was somewhere between, get this, 0.1% and 7% of women experience this after vaginal surgery, which is not a helpful or useful range considering 600,000 hysterectomies are performed in the US every year. So which number is it, science? Are only 600 women a year at risk of nearly dying from vaginal cuff dehiscence, or is it more like 42,000 women a year, which is a significant number of women at risk of sudden death? Why are there no statistics? Simple, because many of the women who fall prey to vaginal cuff dehiscence die before they get to the emergency room. Plus, unlike most surgical complications that befall men, like those following prostate surgery, there is no national reporting system for vaginal cuff dehiscence. None, zero, zip, nada. When we do not gather statistics for female-associated illnesses, when we minimize female pain, when we do not criminalize sexual harassment, when we pay women less, far less, when we discriminate against women's professional advancement, when we call women names, when we blame women for their own assaults and rapes, when we wave the pro-life flag without providing babies or parents with the basic means of survival, health insurance, paid leave, subsidized childcare, universal pre-K, a longer school day, a living wage, when we express discomfort or disgust at female blood, we are not only discriminating against women, we are stealing their livelihood, their health, and their will to keep going. Lady Parts came out on August 3rd, 2021, just 5 months ago. In it, I have a whole chapter on all the ways in which reviewers, both male and female, tear women down in ways that male authors never have to contend with. Quote, "These are not, I want to emphasize, bad reviews," I wrote. Bad reviews I accept and can take, and they are an expected and necessary pitfall of putting a book out in the world. Rather, these are baseless character assassinations, often within the context of an otherwise good review, and misogyny hidden within rhetorical query. On the day my book was published, with those exact words tucked inside it, calling out misogyny hidden within rhetorical query, the New York Times came out with a review of my book, my 7th, though the Times incorrectly called it my 5th, by its former gender editor, a woman. who said she was grossed out by my blood loss and near death, but wondered, quote, is it sexist of me to be grossed out by such an image? Maybe. We endure gory descriptions of men dying in war, but one senses that the shock effect of this first scene is part of the point, and that perhaps Copaken is waiting to call you out for being unable to stomach it, end quote. No, former gender editor of the New York Times, I am not waiting to call you out personally, or anyone for that matter, for being unable to stomach my blood clots. I am, however, calling you out for doing precisely what I rail against in the pages of my book. No, not being grossed out by my blood, but by burying your misogyny within rhetorical query. By asking, is it sexist of me to be grossed out by such an image? You are, a priori, indirectly telling the millions of readers of the New York Times not only that they too should be grossed out, but that any discussion of female-associated viscera is icky, wrong, and inappropriate, even when it nearly killed me. Had this reviewer actually read to the end of my book, she would have read this on page 431, which describes a discussion I had with one of my friends about the appropriateness of speaking out about female blood loss. Quote, but I nearly died, I said, from complications from an operation so common in America that a uterus is excised here on average once every minute. Shouldn't I not only be allowed to talk about this stuff, but rather be compelled to do so? No, she said, it's not appropriate. By whose measure? That is always the question we must be asking ourselves. By whose measure is talking about our bleeding lady parts not appropriate when they are as much a part of our bodies as eyes and lips and hands and hair? By whose measure are the normal processes of our childbearing bodies weaponized into insult, as when Trump derided a female journalist for having, quote, blood coming out of her wherever, or when my daughter and I were not allowed near my Orthodox father-in-law's grave to bury him for fear that the existence of women's menstrual blood near the gravesite might contaminate it? By whose measure is describing illness and surgical complications of our internal reproductive organs wrong? And what do they have to gain from our silence? I'm reminded of the Ladies' Book of Etiquette, Chapter 1, Conversation, published in the mid-1800s. Avoid at all times mentioning subjects or incidents that can in any way disgust your hearers. Many persons will enter into the details of sicknesses which should be mentioned only when absolutely necessary, or describe the most revolting scenes before a room full of people, or even at a table. Others speak of vermin, noxious plants, or instances of uncleanliness. All such conversation or allusion is excessively ill-bred. It is not only annoying, but it is absolutely sickening to some, and a truly ladylike person will avoid all such topics. I love you, I said to my friend, and I hear you, and I appreciate your concern. But the Ladies' Book of Etiquette was written in 1860, and I respectfully disagree with every word of it. Our ignorance, avoidance, and silencing of all discussions of female-associated viscera is not polite. It's killing us. The next morning, I sat down and pounded out the first chapter of my book. So the week both my memoir, Lady Parts, and its misogynist New York Times review were published, I drove my daughter to her first year of medical school at the University of Buffalo. Just before she got out of the car, looking as scared as she did on her first day of kindergarten, I reminded her of the grim statistics for women, particularly those of us in middle age. According to a 2018 Mayo Clinic study, which looked for menopause knowledge gaps in the training of US residents in family medicine, internal medicine, and OBGYN, those doctors, in other words, who should be on the front lines of menopausal medicine, only 6.8% of respondents reported feeling adequately prepared to manage patients in menopause. And a full 20.3% reported having never attended a single lecture on menopausal medicine whatsoever. Don't worry, Mom, said my daughter, whose swift actions 4 years earlier had saved her mother's life. I'll make sure I learn what I need to know. Thank you very much.
Deborah, thank you very much for telling such an amazing story. And on a lighter note, just before we get into the questions, which, by the way, we're opening that up for everybody right now. There's a button on your screen with a Q&A if you'd like to submit your questions, because we'd love to take a few of them here while we have Deborah with us. But on the whole pain scale thing that you mentioned, I'm just like flabbergasted at that, because in our family, I know that my wife's pain threshold is like right around, I can't, and like mine is like, I can't get low enough. Just saying.
Yeah. Yeah, that's normal. I think,
Wow.
which is why it's so crazy. Definitely.
Yeah, totally crazy. All right, so here comes the first question for you. What is one step that we can all take to start fostering change? I love the way they put that question.
We need to vote people into office who believe in universal health care, who believe in paid medical leave, who believe in paid maternity leave. They call this socialism, but I know for a fact, having lived in France for 4 years in a quote unquote socialist state, that this is a really good way of living. When I was living in Paris and I had a medical issue, I went to a doctor and I never paid a dime. We should not be paying. Well, you shouldn't lose your job and suddenly lose your income and then have to pay $2,300 a month in COBRA fees. We're learning that a little bit through this pandemic, I hope, but we are not making structural change. And the only way to make structural change is through policy. So vote into offices those who can make policy changes. That's the only way.
Here's the next question for you. This coming from another one of our group here. What advice, this is kind of interesting being that your daughter is just going off to medical school and is just 4 years away from this number. What advice would you give the 20-year-old Deborah?
The 20-year-old me.
Yes, right.
Well, it's interesting because I'm doing a story right now on ageism. I'm working on a journalism story on ageism. And I spoke to an employment lawyer and I said, I'm doing the story on ageism. And what do you tell older women that come to you? And she said, I talk to the women who come to me in their 20s. When they come to me with an employment contract or whatever it is that they need to work on in their 20s, I say to them, ageism is a feature, not a bug. At 49, you will, if you're working for a multinational company, be fired from your job. They will set you up with a PIP, which is a performance improvement plan, and they will figure out some way to get you off that payroll. Men can work until their 60s because they're believed that they're, taking care of families. Women still are believed that they have a husband at home who is taking care of the bills. And at 49, they don't want you in the office anymore. So she tells women, this lawyer tells all the women that come into her office, have a plan B. Know what kind of entrepreneurial or self, a plan that would allow you to earn money on your own that you can do after 49, because you will not survive. It is part of the way that corporate America works these days. You will not survive. So what I would tell 20-year-old me is figure out what you're going to do after 45 to make money. Because I had been relying on these jobs that when I got breast cancer fired me, or when I called them out for my $39,000 to the male's $200,000. By the way, we'd gone to the same exact school. We'd both gone to Harvard. I was 2 years older. I had much more experience. I had 3 children. I was a single parent. He had no children. Like it was insane to me. So we have to have a way of not relying on corporate America for our income. Now, right now, and I want to say this because it's really interesting. A woman who is the daughter of a billionaire who will remain nameless, read my book, Lady Parts, called me up on the phone, somebody I know in passing, I don't know her very well. She called me up on the phone crying. And she said, I cannot believe that you experienced what you experienced. I have a family foundation and we have health insurance that's associated with our family foundation. I want to give you health insurance. Please allow me to do this. I am now on her family foundation's health insurance, which has allowed me for the first time in my life to not have to get a corporate job. So I am building what is called a Substack, which is my self-publication. So for example, if I write an article for The Atlantic, I get $700.
Okay.
If I write an article for my Substack, I'm building an audience with this thing, and I am creating my own publication that will hopefully provide passive income as I work on my story. So the story on ageism, for example, I'm working on for my Substack. So I would say to my 20-year-old self, have an entrepreneurial idea for what you're going to do after 45, because America does not care about you. America will break you down.
Next question. What is the biggest bias? And that sounded like about 75 billion there that need to be addressed, to be honest. That was crazy. But what's the biggest bias women experience? And then the follow-up, how can women educate their kids on the normality of lady parts?
So very interestingly, I've been zooming into book clubs, and a lot of book clubs are women my age. I'm 55. There's a lot of, 45 to 60-year-old women having book clubs. And one book club in particular said, can we invite our daughters? And I said, well, really? Like what? And I didn't, for some reason, I didn't think, a 20-year-old woman would be interested in what I had to say about middle-aged women. Mm-hmm. What was really interesting to me is it turns out that these younger women are even more interested in the story than their mothers, because this is their future. And they're trying to figure out, how do we change this? Like, how can we, as women heading out into the workforce, as women who want to have children, but want to be paid for a maternity leaves. Right now, maternity leaves often bankrupt a family. Like I was the main breadwinner during all 3 of my maternity leaves, and I wanted to breastfeed for 6 months, and I wanted to take that time off. We went into credit card debt during that time. That shouldn't happen. In Norway and Sweden and in some of the other countries, they have a policy by which when a woman has a baby, either the male or the female, either the mother or the father, or in case there's 2 women or 2 men, either of the 2 partners must take 12 months of leave. You must take it, and you get paid 100% of your salary. Now, if only one person in that dyad takes the maternity leave, you only get 11 months. Everybody has to take at least a month. So what they're doing is they're encouraging fathers to get involved. Mm-hmm. And they're encouraging a dual 50-50 parenting scheme. So what is the question was really, what is the worst bias? I really don't think that we can untangle the biases of sexism. Like, that sexism is the bias, right?
Right.
Viewing women as lesser than men, viewing women as less deserving of money than men, viewing women as sexual objects. So sexism is the bias. And from that, it's like, imagine all these little branches. So what we need to attack is sexism, and ageism falls under that umbrella as well. Now, which one am I experiencing most right now? Right now, I'm experiencing the horrors of ageism, the true horrors of ageism. Before I started my Substack, I applied for probably 100 different jobs. Now, remember, I'm a Golden Globe nominee. I won an Emmy. I've been nominated for Emmys. My books are bestsellers. I write for The Atlantic. I have, I don't know how much better my resume could be for a journalism job. I don't even get called back. I don't get an email back.
And it's stellar, right? It's stellar. It really, truly is.
I have applied for 100 jobs and I gave up. I'm 55 years old and I have given up. So right now it's Substack or bust. That's what I'm doing right now.
Gotcha. All right, so one last question. We're going to kind of switch it on to a lighter note as we finish up here. You've had the opportunity to obviously travel the world as a photojournalist. What would be the 5 places on the planet everyone should visit?
Oh, that's such a good question. All right, Paris, number 1. Paris is my favorite place on earth. It's where I became a young woman. I moved there at 22. It formed me, and it's not only just the place Paris, but it's sort of this Parisian ideals or French ideals, which is you take time to eat your lunch. You don't eat a sad desk salad at your desk. You go out for lunch. You enjoy it with others. I mean, right now during a pandemic, okay, so you eat the sad desk salad. But it's an idea of enjoying your life and living to work. Working to live rather than living to work. So Paris is one.
Gotcha.
Kathmandu, Nepal was fascinating place. I write about it in Lady Parts. Again, I love the culture. I love the views of the mountains, but I also love the culture and the sort of idea of healing from within, and meditation, Buddhism, all that stuff comes from there. And they have their citizens are really gentle and really kind and really calm. And it was a good place to heal from a lot of the chaos that I described. Okay, Paris, Kathmandu. Bali, I think, is a really beautiful and interesting place. And now I'm going to pick a fourth one that is going to be surprising, but I hope one day that we can all visit it, which is Afghanistan. So I covered the Afghan war when I was a cub reporter. It is so breathtakingly beautiful. As the bombs are dropping, I'm looking around at the mountains and how gorgeous it is. It's just north of, of Nepal. So it's in that same mountain range of the Himalayas. I hope one day that Afghanistan becomes a country that we can all visit, because I know this sounds crazy too, but the Afghan people, those who are not in the Taliban, are a generous, kind, brilliant, hardworking people that their entire nation is about taking in the guest. That you bring the guest into your home, you feed them, you give them tea. That is part of their culture. All right, so that's 4. And was there 5 they wanted, right?
They wanted the 5th one, so if you got one more, let us have it.
Well, I spent my summer when I was 17 living in Japan. And Japan is such a wacky culture. I mean, it's just so different than our culture. So I'll give you a perfect example. It's Sunday and you're at the Imperial Castle and there's a street light, but there's no traffic around the Imperial Castle on Sundays. There's no traffic, but Japanese will follow the street signs. Like if it says don't walk, they won't walk, even though there's no cars going by. I mean, there's no guns. It's like, it's a very peaceful, kind of wonderful, wonderful community.
Yeah, no,